Hi, I'm Kayla Hathaway, partner here at Cimpatico. I'm launching our climate.edu channel to help students learn about the degree programs that are training the future leaders of the green economy. I'll be interviewing graduate program leaders about the degrees offered at their schools, how applicants can best prepare, what to expect as a student, research and internship opportunities, and long-term career prospects. I'll also be asking renowned professors and grad students for their thoughts on the types of skills undergraduates should focus on developing as they prepare for a master's or doctorate program. And now, on to today's show. Hello everyone and welcome back to Climate EDU. I am your host, Kayla Hathaway, and today I have the pleasure of starting our first book series with Gerald Kootenay. Gerald Kootenay is an author and media commentator on the politics of the climate crisis. He's authored the book Carbon Politics and the Failure of the Kyoto Protocol, and his consulting firm, 6 Elements Sustainable Management, specializes in helping entrepreneurs make their bioeconomy projects a success. Gerald, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
Oh, great, Kayla. Thank you very much for having me.
It's always a pleasure. I love like scrolling through your Twitter feed and just following all of your hot takes. So
Some people don't like my Twitter feed, though. You've seen those comments too, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, I was even looking on like today where it was, advertising our episode. And people are like, oh, well, the climate crisis is fake. I'm like, come on, y'all. No, it's not. Anyway, so your book, Carbon Politics and the Failure of the Kyoto Protocol. You wouldn't mind, just enlightening the audience. What inspired you to write this book?
Over a decade ago, I became interested in climate change. And I was wondering, I looked at the science, seemed to me that said everything you needed to know. Why wasn't more being done? And the Rio Convention had taken place. Kyoto was around for over a decade. And so I thought, okay, well, I'm going to look at some books about why Kyoto isn't working. I couldn't find any. And so I said, okay, well, maybe I'll do it myself. And what started off as a small enterprise, after about 3 years of off and on work, out came the book. And it was actually a fascinating episode, because before I dived into it, I really had no idea how these UN conventions worked, or even what a convention was at that point in time.
Yeah, when I was reading through your book and learning about, because for the longest time, I thought COP just stood for Copenhagen. And instead it was it a convention of the parties?
Conference of the parties.
Conference of the parties. And I was like, oh wait. Or the abbreviation UNFCCC, and
there's a lot of C's in that word.
Yeah. It was definitely enlightening though, learning the processes of these gatherings and conferences, and it puts everything into a more informed perspective, I think, is the biggest takeaway that I had from reading the book. And you wrote it very, very well, in my personal opinion.
Thank you.
So, Carbon Politics, for the audience that may not know, is divided into 5 parts. And in this episode, we're going to be going over part 1. And this was all about the formation of climate treaty and how the IPCC, how it works. And so if we can go ahead and go back on the conversation of COP. Gerald, if you wouldn't mind explaining what a UN Framework Convention and the Conference of Parties even are, for those that wouldn't know what those are.
When I first looked at it, you said what the name is, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Mm-hmm. Framework Convention, I actually didn't know what a Framework Convention was. Conventions are something you go where you present papers at. Framework conventions are UN jargon for treaties.
Oh, okay.
And they started using them, especially in the 1970s. They became more popular with environmental issues. And they were generally set up for treaties that would involve something that was somewhat controversial, that the world would be a better place if the world agreed not to do something.
Hmm.
And in the case of climate change, the science had been growing for decades. In the 1980s, it was really coming into its own. There was a little doubt that we were getting into trouble. And on the recommendation of members of the UN, it came from the United Kingdom in this case, it was recommended that they do a framework convention. So that goes out to the general vote. The vote comes in and says, yeah, this is a great thing, well, let's do it.
Okay.
And what came out of that was the idea of having the Rio Convention. And Rio was about the environment overall, but climate change was a major part of it. And the one thing that really amazed me about, you can imagine that how much work it takes to get most of the countries of the world to agree to anything at any time. In fact, it's really mind-boggling. And the one thing I learned from doing this was I really respect the people that try to put these together. And what happens at the end, everyone complains about it. Doesn't matter what you do, but just the idea that you've accomplished this is a tremendous accomplishment in its own right.
Yeah, when I was going through it and reading about like just how many nations were present to go and start discussing the outline of Kyoto and the need for a group to actually really like dig in and address this, it was very impressive. And even kind of looking at a more recent thing, like with Paris, how what was it, like 195 nations all were like, yes, let's agree on this. I'm like, wow, that's a doozy. That's a very impressive number. So before we get into like the actual IPCC, we mentioned Rio, and I had no idea that Rio even happened, or like, so what was the result of Rio, and how did that lead into Kyoto?
Rio is where the UNFCCC was agreed to take place.
Mm.
And the way the framework conventions work, you first put together a general agreement. So it's almost like a memorandum of understanding in business. It says, here are the basic terms that we want to have a formal treaty about. And so at Rio, what was especially daunting for that one is that the bureaucrats who had to put it together had like 18 months to do it,
Oh,
because the real date had been set, and they managed to put together agreement in that 18 months. What always happens in these negotiations, they always go to the lowest common denominator. And that's because they have to be by consensus. Most of the members of the United Nations, they don't necessarily have to agree with it, but they can't object to it. And there's a subtle difference between the two. But again, when you're dealing with countries, some of them hate each other's guts. You know, some of them may be big fossil fuel producers that their whole economy depends on it. To get them to agree to anything that could threaten themselves is really, really hard to do. Remember, no government truly cares for the world above their own best interests. Some are a little bit more generous than others, but they're elected to take care of their own government.
yeah.
And so that's what happens in these things. And so at the end of the Rio conference, and the UNFCCC was agreed to, it's like a big party. You know, you saw what Copenhagen was like and Paris was like. The press all writes about it, and there's, you know, cheering and stuff like that. And what happens is that the bureaucrats have done all the hard work. They've already got a general agreement beforehand. Then comes the big day of the signing ceremonies, and then the big shots show up. You know, and they can be senior ministers, or they can be presidents and prime ministers, and they're coming, and the negotiations are all over with. it's understood that they're all going to sign as they go along.
Yeah.
But nothing becomes law until, first of all, a certain number of countries ratify that agreement. And ratification means that the country has agreed to abide by it. So they've made it part of their rules and regulations as they go on. That's the real important moment in these negotiations.
Got it. So then after Rio, that's like going from there, we started getting into negotiations for Kyoto.
Yeah, and then that's very interesting because what happens is that was the next step. Because again, we already had this general agreement, but it's not a true treaty yet.
Mhm.
It's just set up the principles, the general principles. And so in between that, what you have to do is you have to do the protocol. Now, in the case, this was the Kyoto Protocol. They're often named after the city that they're ultimately signed in.
Mhm.
And in between, you have all more dirty work of getting down to the nitty gritty that people are going to agree to. So crossing the T's, dotting the I's, and that is just another set of daunting steps that goes through.
Mhm.
When you hit the protocol, it goes through the same thing. There's the big party, the bureaucrats have done all the work, and often in the last seconds, they're still trying to take care of the last minute details.
Yeah.
These meetings famously go on to 24 hours straight, and
Oh,
the
no.
people are exhausted at the end. The presidents and prime ministers, when they show up, they're all happy and smiley. They put their signatures on, and then they can go back home.
Hmm.
What happens then is, even though the first agreement was the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol, or any protocol that's agreed, then becomes part of that.
Okay.
So now it's officially a treaty. So the real treaty, which contains the Kyoto Protocol, is the UNFCCC even today.
Dang. It is a very complicated process.
It is a very complicated process, and the people that do it are highly professional.
Mhm.
And again, there are framework conventions that literally the UN has been discussing for decades and still doesn't have a protocol for.
Mhm. So overall, like Kyoto, even though as we get like more into the discussion about the protocol and how it's kind of a paper tiger in some sense, the fact that it even was put together is an accomplishment.
Now, in the book, I'm a little bit hard on what happened with Kyoto,
Mhm.
and that's because I was frustrated. But that has nothing to do with my respect for the people that had to put this together.
Mhm.
It was an incredible job. But as the book title says, Kyoto was a failure. And it was a failure as soon as the protocol was agreed to,
Mhm.
and for two major reasons. One, the US had told the negotiators the minimum that they needed, or they couldn't accept it.
Mm.
Now, they had very little choice in this. This wasn't something that, yeah, the president could for Rio it was Bush, for Kyoto was Clinton,
Mhm.
could say, oh yeah, I agree with this and we're going to get it ratified. Al Gore signed the Kyoto Protocol, but he told the members right there and then the US was not going to ratify it because of the political restraints that they had going in. So right off the bat, the US was out. At the time, the largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. Number two, China had no emission targets because it was in the developing world, and none of the developing countries, for good reasons,
Mhm.
but right off the bat, the two largest emitters in the world had no targets whatsoever.
Jeez.
And so right from the start, it wasn't going to have an effect.
Yeah. And so this like what caused like the politicization of science? Like going through and reading even how the IPCC was being created, there just seemed to be a lot of disagreement and dispute about their job and the purpose and what their results would even mean for policymakers.
Well, what you've identified is one of the challenges of what's this inherent characteristic of United Nations. Everyone is equal.
Mm.
So every nation has the same vote. There are Security Council members that have a special veto and stuff like that. But for anything that happens in the General Assembly, everyone has the same vote. It doesn't matter if you're United States, Russia, Argentina, Canada, it doesn't matter as you're going along. When you have committees, there's lots of UN requirements for those committees that go beyond the purpose of the committees to begin with. And they can have lots of challenges. And if you take a look, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit more about the IPCC.
Mm-hmm.
The IPCC was officially formed, and the parent organizations were the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environmental Program.
Mm-hmm.
Were the co-sponsors, but they were never the boss of IPCC. They
So then
attempted to
who's
be
the...
at times. They didn't really have a boss.
Mm-hmm.
And so what they did is everyone has to take care of what they believe is the understanding of what they're supposed to be doing. And there is a hierarchy within the UN, but again, a large amount of autonomy for each one of the organizations as well. It's not like the Secretary General calls up the IPCC's head and said, hey, I'm your boss, this is what you have to do.
So then who is the boss of the IPCC? Like,
it's really the chairman.
the chairman. Okay.
And the very first one was Bert Bolin, one of the most famous climate scientists of his day. And he did a marvelous job on there had never been a committee like the IPCC before, which again, it was separate from, they were part of the UNFCCC, they came out of that, but they were an independent organization. And really they're the most probably famous face of the whole climate negotiations. When their reports come out, it's a real big deal.
Yeah. Remember, it was one of the more recent reports a couple years ago. That was the announcement of 2030. I think it was in when they were saying we need to go and cut a lot of our emissions by 2030, and it caused a whole media storm.
Well, it causes a media storm, and then brings out the contrarians and climate deniers out as well.
Mm-hmm.
And often these are orchestrated, and they're vicious, and they're trying to attack anything to do with it as goes along. Mm-hmm. That report you were mentioning, which was what I think late October, it was called the SR15. And it was talking about what happens between keeping emission or temperature rise between 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius, which is the actual requirement of the Paris Agreement. Mm-hmm. It doesn't talk about emissions per se. It talks about restricting the temperature rise. Mm-hmm. And it's not that in 2030 that if we don't do it, it's the world sort of collapses or something happens. It's just a target. But the thing with climate change and the temperature rise, the longer you take, the worse it gets, and it can get a lot worse. And so it's not that 2030 is the worst. If you don't do anything, every year afterwards is going to be worse and worse and worse. So you can say, well, we'll wait for better science to come along and we can take care of it later on. There's just going to be more to be done. You're going to have to suffer longer. And the problem with climate change is once you stop the emissions, it's going to take centuries before those emissions start coming down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was something where we just had Rick Parnell, I think is his last name on, and his organization is wanting to address that part of taking the gases out of the atmosphere, and so through revitalizing land, kelp forests, all these other ways. So that way, once we do stop emitting, we have the means to go and remove the emissions. He's very aggressive on it and wants to have us reach below 300 parts per million by 2050. So we'll see how that goes. But
it sounds like it's part of Project Drawdown. The work to, and it's the type of thing that everything has to be on the table. Mm-hmm. The one thing I think almost everyone agrees, there's no magic bullet. It's not that this is what we should do. And by the way, the IPCC never tells us what we have to do.
Hmm.
It gives us the options of what we should do without really, it tells us the strengths and weaknesses of each option, but they don't say, here's number one, here's number two, here's number three. And in fairness, what could be right for the US could be different than Canada, could be different than Algeria or Australia, wherever the case may be.
Yeah, absolutely. And so with the like just going a little bit more into the IPCC, it was learning about the process on how these reports are even put together. Like that was a really eye-opening experience because before it just seemed like, oh, they're this mystical organization that just has the best scientists. So if you can explain just how the IPCC even like works. So we know the boss is the chairman, and what's the rest of the organization like?
There's a bureau.
A bureau. Okay.
It's sort of like a board of directors, and often the people there are recognized scientists, if not at least highly involved in the bureaucracy of science within their own countries. Often they're political appointees, and they sort of are the editors and the managers of things. The actual people who write the reports are recognized scientists within the climate sciences. A lot of them are university professors. Some of them work for large government organizations, but they're not employees of the IPCC. They don't get paid. And usually you're getting some of the top people in the world either being part of the bureau or actually writing it. And they narrow it down. You know, you have people called like lead authors. Okay, they're going to take care of a chapter for you.
Yeah.
And then within that chapter, okay, this guy's going to take care of this section for you. And so you can imagine these people have to review tens of thousands of papers, tens of thousands. And so you have this umbrella, let's call it, of some of the best scientists in the world looking at this. But then the bureau and the structure has to put this together into something coherent.
Mm-hmm.
Then they have to check that there's no mistakes in it. And so just the entire enterprise itself is huge.
Mm-hmm.
And the IPCC has done a marvelous job. Has it been perfect? Absolutely not. No process could be with what they have to do.
Yeah.
The problem you run into with the IPCC is there is a group associated with the fossil fuel industry that is looking for an uncrossed T, an undotted I. And when they find it, it's the biggest piece of corruption that's ever happened in the history of science.
Yeah.
This stuff is so ridiculous, but this propaganda is so pervasive and so powerful, and it's done by some of the top PR firms in the world on behalf of them.
Mm-hmm.
The world has been cheated and fooled by what these statements come out at the end. But there has never been a science so scrutinized in history as climate change. And the IPCC is a major part of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is just completely blown by. Like, if we could like just keep talking for hours. But on the topic of, so I'll go ahead and wrap it up here and incentivize people to come back for future episodes. With the IPCC, there were some interesting gate events like Glacier Gate and was it Nethergate and but the emails.
We'll be talking more about the gates and it's actually a bad term to use.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, there was no conspiracy going on. There was no evil doing going on, mm-hmm. except by the people who reported the gates.
Yep.
And we'll talk about that more later on. But, you know, if you talk about the infamous climate gate and the emails, there was a crime committed. Mm-hmm. And that crime was the illegal hacking of computers and stealing people's personal emails.
Yep.
Isn't it just a coincidence that happened just a couple of months before Copenhagen was supposed to take place? Glacier Gate There was a mistake in the, I think it was the third assessment report on the glaciers in the Himalayas, and that became part of GlacierGate. It was one mistake in one page, in one paragraph of like 10 trillion pages of notes.
Yeah.
Okay. And yes, it was a mistake. And you thought that the greatest sin in science had ever taken place. There's no sin. Somebody made a mistake and the organization missed it. When did that happen? Just before Copenhagen. Isn't that amazing that these great, horrible things that had happened within the IPCC just happened to be revealed just before Copenhagen was about to take place? There is where the conspiracy lies, which people don't talk about.
It's like, it's not like they're completely trying to undermine the validity of this organization or anything.
The one thing I do know is the people that are participating, they're some of the top scientists in the world. Okay, most of them don't have a political bone in their bodies, and they are top scientists. And the criticism with these gate scandals are totally unjustified. And like in ClimateGate, there's been like a dozen international investigations because of all the hype that came out of this. And not one of them really found any wrongdoing on behalf of the scientists that were involved.
Yeah, I'm very excited for our future episodes. So for those that are in the chat and watching our lovely episode, either here on Cimpatico or over on YouTube, Gerald will be joining me again for 4 more episodes, because for 4 more parts of his book, and we'll get into the quote scandals that really shouldn't have been scandals, as we just mentioned, and also the dispute between the phrase common but differentiated responsibilities, which is still a doozy today. Well, thank you so much, Gerald. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up our episode here, and we'll roll into just chatting to take some questions from the chat. Give me one
Sounds
moment.
good. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thank you.